All right, welcome to Slimehouse, a podcast of crude humor, outrageous hijinks, and a little mild language. I'm Dracula.
I'm the Wolfman.
I'm the Gill Man.
And I'm Frankenstein.
So for this month in October, we're diving into some of the spookiest slime over the decades. And today we're kicking things off with an early brew, 1987's The Monster Squad.
Once upon a time, it was one monster per movie. Those were the good old days.
We're the Monster Squad. Only one way to kill a werewolf. Kick him in the nose! Do it! Wolfman's got a nose!
The Monster Squad, rated PG-13.
So the Monster Squad follows a group of grade school horror movie buffs who find themselves in a real-life monster mash when Dracula and his contemporaries, including the Wolfman, the Mummy, Frankenstein, the creature from the Black Lagoon, all descend upon their small town in search of an ancient book written by Van Helsing himself, and of course, mischief and outrageous hijinks ensue. The film was directed by Fred Decker, who didn't do too much else in his career, RoboCop 3, a couple of other B horror movies, but I think significantly it's co-written by Shane Black, who's now possibly an A-list director, directing Iron Man 3, The Nice Guys, and writing a ton of Hollywood hits, including Lethal Weapon, which was his calling card this same exact year, 1987. And the cast is a lot of young teen stars, but nobody who really took off. Except for John Grease, who you might know as Uncle Rico. He stars as the Wolfman. But let's dive into it, you guys. Where do you guys see this fitting into kind of the Slimehouse timeline?
Well, I'd say it kind of fits like a perfect mix between the two proto-Slimehouse genres of something like the Goonies and something like Weird Science, where like it's a bunch of kids going on adventures and kind of getting into trouble, and also brings in some sci-fi and horror elements out of something like Weird Science.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, definitely to me, the Goonies, I think, is a great reference for this.
I feel like there's a natural progression from... We did Weird Science earlier, which is much more of a teen movie, and we're going to get into peak Slimehouse later, which is much more of kids' movies, you know, the protagonists being 8 or 9 years old. This is sort of right in between those, where it's not quite a teen movie. I think the kids are supposed to be around 12 to 14 years old.
Specifically 12. There's a line that says, "I'm 12."
Right, that's right. But kind of like the Goonies, they're the older characters who are teenagers who are a key to the plot. And to state the obvious, it's very much a carbon copy of a lot of Goonies elements at times.
I feel like this and the Goonies are the same idea, which is this template of kids' movies in the 80s in this kind of suburban setting, but with the influence of genre movies. The Goonies, it's like adventure films, swashbucklers, Indiana Jones. It's also because Spielberg wrote the story for that movie, but in this film, Monster Squad, it's basically classic horror movies. They're Frankenstein and Dracula, Wolfman, Mummy, the classic Universal horror movies. And it's very much an homage to them, but also very cheerfully, playfully subverting those types of films as well.
Yeah, because there's like a number of like really direct references to those Universal movies that I noticed. Especially there's a scene that pretty much does shot for shot the scene in Frankenstein where he comes upon the little girl like throwing flowers in the water. They kind of spoof that scene in a way where, of course, he doesn't kill the girl like he does in the original Frankenstein, but it's very much a reference to that, and more subtly even the Dracula scene at the very beginning. There's armadillos all around the castle, which is actually something from like the original Dracula movie, which I'd forgotten about the movie till I was doing research. There's a bunch of armadillos in Dracula's castle in that movie for whatever reason. I think it might just be with where they filmed it, but It's definitely something that people remember about that one.
One thing that I thought of too is we talk a lot about Slimehouse being a genre of a lot of remakes and a lot of reboots, reimaginings. And to me, this kind of played as a way of reimagining, or at least an attempt to reimagine these Universal monster movies for a younger audience. And to me, that really speaks true to kind of the Slimehouse mentality. And I think it's an early example of bringing that classic Hollywood narrative to the modern.
The then modern age of like the 80s. I think we are saying the same thing about how the Goonies in this are taking archetypes and visual ideas from these classic movies and projecting them into this Reagan era suburbia.
Totally, yeah. And on that Goonies tip, going off what Nelson was saying, some very almost suspicious similarities between these two narratives.
Yes.
You have, and this is a trope that we see a lot in these kids' movies, the character of, pardon me, but the fat kid, as he is literally called in this movie, who is similar to Chunk in the Goonies. You have Frankenstein, who's the lovable monster whom everyone is scared of at first, who ends up being the tender plot turner in the end, similar to Sloth in the Goonies. And then literally you have the same actress playing the mom, Mary Ellen Trainor, in both movies. And even the narrative is a little bit similar too. This idea of this motley crew of kids, these dorks, these nerds, these outcasts, coming together for an adventure that seems beyond plausibility.
I even saw somewhere online comments about it being such a knockoff of Goonies, but I think it's a step closer to the Slimehouse genre in its most peak form. Because Goonies is definitely Proto-Slime, and this I would call this Proto-Slime as well. I don't think it's peak slime, but this is closer in the timeline to where Slimehouse really erupted.
I agree that this is definitely a proto-slime film, but definitely captures more of the spirit. But I think something that's interesting is this is a PG-13 movie, and it's a lot more vulgar than a lot of the kind of peak slime you will see. There's a lot of swearing, there's a lot of expletives. The humor is a little more crude and adult, kind of like what we saw in Weird Science earlier.
Also a PG-13 movie.
Yeah, feels like it's transitioning down from Weird Science, but it does feel like it has a step in the John Hughes camp still. I actually didn't even know what this movie was rated when I was watching it, but I was like, damn, pulling a lot of mild language as we now.
I think the similarities between this and Weird Science are interesting. I think we got quite a bit into how Weird Science looks, sounds, and feels in 2020, how the humor hasn't aged that well in that, and we noticed some of that in this, but not nearly to the same degree. We did mention there's the character who he's literally called Bat Kid. There's a lot of scenes and lines that can eventually land on some sort of crude fat-shaming joke. There's some other kind of dated general mean-spiritedness that we observed, some homophobic jokes, some slut-shaming at some point towards one of the character's older sisters. And one thing I thought was similar to Weird Science was that the ending of the movie involves this showdown with these creatures or monsters from other films. With Weird Science, there was like Hills Have Eyes and Mad Max characters showing up at the end, and it didn't really tie in with anything that was happening in the movie, and it was just kind of random. But here it's like obviously part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, it's something I noticed is actually while we were just talking about this, that both this and Weird Science, this more directly, of course, reference Frankenstein. I mean, the plot of Weird Science is what if, like, instead of Frankenstein's monster, they made like a hot woman to be their girlfriend. And I mean, this obviously, Frankenstein's monster is one of the main characters, because we've talked about before how Slimehouse is kind of like these pulp fiction kind of movies targeted towards a child audience, and I feel like the monster movies, even though they're looked at more esteemed as kind of classics now, kind of were the pulp fiction of their times.
Yes.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that this is less of a direct wish fulfillment narrative kind of movie. Like, you know, the bully characters are kind of like dealt with at the beginning of the movie. They're not kind of like made like legitimate characters throughout the film. I do think this movie is not as interested in the school environment as Weird Science is, but it's not like the Goonies where you never see these kids in school. And establishes through the initial scene with the principal that they can't pay attention in class. They're drawing pictures of monsters, and it gives you a really good sense of like what their personalities are like. From there, it kind of progresses into a more traditional kind of like adventure.
Yeah, something that I think that speaks to is it feels like in a lot of Slimehouse movies, school is secondary.
Yeah, yeah.
Aside from some obvious, ones that come to mind that are set in a school, like Max Keeble's Big Move, which would come almost 15 years after this. Kids don't want to see a movie about school. They want to see a movie about having fun outside of school. So school is almost just a way of showing, oh, these are kids in a school. They go to school. They're just like you, but they have a whole lot of fun outside of the classroom. And I think that that's a really interesting note. There's always this kind of punk attitude towards school being boring or useless.
Yeah.
There's a funny line in the first scene with the principal while the kids are in detention where he says, "Science is cool, man." In a totally, I'm getting down to these kids' level, but it's played in a way where, science isn't cool. School isn't cool. We don't want to be here. Monsters are what are cool. So that heightened attitude and almost anti-school attitude, I think, is very, very indicative of later Slimehouse themes.
Yeah, because I actually thought it was interesting, when they're leaving the principal's office, talking about, this is actually where some of, the old school, homophobia came into play. They're, talking about how the principal's, gay, and how they think he was, touching their shoulders weird or something, which I feel like, and, that's never corrected or anything for them, so it's, a very anarchic, this principal, as far as we can tell, doesn't do anything bad. He's not an awful guy or anything, but just by being the principal, he's already the enemy.
And that's a perfect segue into some tropes, but specifically character archetypes, which is always a favorite thing to discuss. Something we haven't talked about yet are the authoritative figures that keep showing up in these movies, and they're buffoons always, or they're kind of out of touch squares most of the time, and the principal archetype, or whoever's in charge of detention, the disciplinarian archetype, is really fun to see in these movies.
Yeah, I feel like it's very common to have a scene where a character like this tries to be with it and use the hip slang, and then you're supposed to laugh and think that's inherently funny. This guy's oh, this guy thinks he's cool and with it, but he's a principal. He's just in it to make these kids have no fun.
And it's funny because beyond the principal, Frankenstein in this movie also learns kind of the hip lingo with bogus.
Bogus.
And that reminded me a lot of Encino Man, which I think is also essential Proto-Slime, maybe full slime, where it's the character that's sort of a Neanderthal type using and learning the cool ways of the 80s is a very go-to joke and stuff like this.
I mean, that's in Terminator 2 as well. That's the first thing I think of with that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Lingo doesn't have the weight it had at that time, where it was what is the lingo? What's the thing I should say? Bogus, man. I guess it's not as direct as it used to be.
It's lit.
Yeah, with meme culture, it's even more, I would say, it's more proliferated, the lingo, and it changes faster. It's more rapid.
Let me modify that. I would say movies used to kind of be what taught people the lingo in a weird way. And now with social media, we don't need movies to be
okay, that's fair,
telling us bogus, man, or lit, or TikTok, or whatever.
Totally. Yeah, there's a scene in the Angry Birds movie where they talk about squad goals. And I just rolled my eyes when I saw that. Because it was used so out of context and so incorrectly. Not that I am, promoting using that term by any means, but it was so awful in how it was done, and it was just clear misunderstanding of how that phrase was used at the time. But I think that's a really, really astute observation, Nelson, in that
for sure.
A lot of movies back in this time, 80s, 90s, and even the early thousands, that's where we got a lot of our jokes from and our cultural references from. And now it's from social media, it's from Twitter, it's from Instagram and memes.
Another character archetype that I think we're going to see a lot is the mysterious neighbor who's scary and then turns out to have a heart of gold or be a ally of sorts. And the first movie I think of that shares this is Home Alone, which has a very prominent use of this. But in today's movie, it's so obvious to us, perhaps, that when they see the scary house with the old man that it's not going to be what they think it is. And
Yeah.
And this was made before Home Alone, so maybe it was establishing that trope in Slime.
Yeah. And he also, he turns out to be, like, actually an ally much earlier than I feel like. Like, usually I feel like it's the end of the movie when it turns out, like, oh, the neighbor's actually good. But he, like, helps them translate the German or whatever it is, the Polish or whatever, like, pretty early, yeah, like pretty early on in the movie. And he continues from that point on to be kind of a key ally of the Monster Squad.
yeah, I really liked this older character guy. I thought it was one of the better examples of this archetype. And I want to bring up the fascinating moment where he says, I have seen real monsters, and they just subtly show that he has a Holocaust scar, which was pretty nuts to throw in there casually.
Very bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember seeing this as a kid. I didn't really get that at first, because I thought I was probably like 7 or 8, and I didn't really understand, like, the Holocaust, like, tattoo thing. But yeah, that was a very heavy theme to bring into this movie, especially to, like, not acknowledge that much from that point on. But I guess it does a lot to really, like, make us empathize with this character right off the bat, for sure.
Yeah, for me it was interesting because the first time I watched this movie, I thought that was gonna come back in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was supposed to.
Like, he was a time traveler and they were gonna maybe tie the Holocaust to the monsters, like they were somehow involved, but it just is kind of this weird random reference that's just they have in the middle of this movie.
Yeah.
Especially because the movie doesn't go that deep. It's a short movie. It's 82 minutes solid. And so there's there's very little kind of character development of this type where it's kind of below the surface. So for them to throw in something like that, I definitely kind of was taken aback.
Yeah, I read that, like, there is a significant amount of this movie that was cut out to get it as short as it was, which made me curious about maybe if there was more about that in some of the cut scenes, because, yeah, a lot of scenes in the screenplay apparently were cut, and a lot of stuff that was filmed was cut. So, yeah, I was wondering if this came up any more, or if it was just meant to be this very subtle kind of moment.
Speaking of neighbors, another trope I think that shows up quite a bit in these Slimehouse movies is the hot girl next door, or the hot older sister, to almost kind of a very sleazy degree.
Yeah, for sure. Because they end up blackmailing her with, like, nude photos at one point, which is maybe the element that ages the worst of this movie, if I had to pick something.
It was the most weird sciencey part of the movie.
For sure, yeah.
Definitely, but I think Frankenstein took the photos, like,
yeah, he
mistakenly.
takes it on accident, and then, like, the cool kid, Rudy, I think is his name, finds them on the camera, like, from the Polaroid or whatever, and decides to use them, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very kind of bizarre twist of events.
The kid's already spying on her, so I don't know why Frankenstein had to be the one to take the pictures if he was going to use them later anyways, but I don't know, I guess.
No, they needed him to have that in the banging montage when they he's holding the picture up and they can't reach. They needed to set that up.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, they needed that gag.
These movies that are almost all a cast of male characters, they need to kind of throw in at least one girl into the mix. They have the younger sister who is very cute. I enjoyed her moments, but they also, that's less common to see in these movies. It is very common to see the hot, elusive older girl.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, also the cool older kid that's hanging with, like, the lame young kids to get the hot older girl. I think the Goonies has that with Josh Brolin's character. I think likes the girl, yeah. And I feel like that's very common, that there's a cool kid that's, like, kind of lowering himself to hang out with these losers to get, like, the hot girl, but then he ends up, like, actually being their friend. So.
Yes.
I think another archetypal character that shows up in these kinds of movies and shows up here is a character that is close to the action, family member sometimes, in this case the dad, and he is a cop. It's kind of related to what's going on in the main story and the mystery and the adventure that the kids are going through, in parallel trying to solve a crime. And he's getting a lot of information that he doesn't believe about being these monsters around town. There's a lot of slime movies where people are portrayed in this kind of, like, it kind of makes it seem like their job is mundane, and it's
Mundane.
like, yeah, it's like a lot of bogus.
Bogus.
They feel like most of it they can't really take seriously, and they're just kind of over it.
Yeah.
A lot of these movies take place in small towns, and I think part of the joke in a lot of these movies is, oh, nothing extraordinary ever happens in these towns. Nothing extraordinary happens in the suburbs. Why should we believe that this man is a wolf, a werewolf? Why
Yeah.
should we believe that Dracula would come to small town USA? And kind of on the mention of the father being a cop, there's also this theme that we see a lot in these Slimehouse movies about marital troubles or trouble keeping relationships afloat.
Yep.
And it's kind of unclear exactly why the mother and the father in the movie, the central mother and father in this movie, are having marital troubles, but it's there. And I think a lot of maybe in before they trimmed this movie down, there was a sense of the kids were helping save the marriage, or you know
Sounds familiar.
there is that element left in kind of the final showdown where the younger sister character, who's actually very funny in this movie,
I liked her a lot.
where the younger sister character is being kind of held in a chokehold by Dracula, and the mom and the father have a shared moment of, no, Phoebe, like, don't hurt her.
Conflict between parents.
Yeah, and we've seen this in House Arrest. We see this in Flubber in a different way. He keeps forgetting his wedding, but this idea of you gotta work hard to keep a marriage together, and a lot of times it's the kids that do that.
Yeah, and I mean, you kind of see the dad fill kind of a sub archetype of kind of like the hairy dad that's like trying his best, especially in the scene where he like the kid wants to go see a horror movie. I think Groundhog Day 12.
Groundhog Day Part 12.
Yeah, Groundhog Day Part 12, which this movie predates Groundhog Day. At first I was like, what the hell, Groundhog Day Part 12, and it's a horror movie, but yeah, this predates Groundhog Day. But yeah, the kid wants to see some slasher movie called Groundhog Day Part 12, and the dad like can't take him, but then the dad like brings him Burger King, I think, actually, and they like sit on the roof together and kind of watch it like from afar, the drive-in. So I feel like in all these movies you either get like a dad that's like misses the game, or you get a dad that's doing his best, like, but struggling.
But
I feel
his
like
best just wasn't enough. Yeah.
I think this is a very big Slimehouse trope that shows up in this movie. Is it gives the kids more power in the narrative, that they are aware and taking steps towards preventing the conflict than the police force, than the law enforcement, than the people who are supposed to protect the town. The kids are a step ahead. They know what's going on. They somehow have figured out how to defeat evil, whereas the police force can't figure it out. They're the bumbling idiots. The kids
Yeah, they're very inept, and I feel like they always will like step in at the last minute, help but not lead the action at the end. Then the kids apologize. They're like, "We're sorry, we didn't believe you. We should have done more. We should have like." They're not exactly like idiots or enemies in the way that school authority figures are, but they're very much inept and like need the help of the child characters to get anything done.
Yeah, that aloofness really shows up in one scene. It's one of my favorites in the movie, but it's a prime example of a kid not really being listened to, and it's when the mummy shows up and he kind of hides in the kid's closet. He calls his dad in to go investigate. The mummy is basically hiding in plain sight in the closet, and like the dad is not even looking in the closet. He just kind of assumes nothing's there, and it's just typical childhood nightmares taking over for his son. And that idea, that image, is something that we see a lot in these movies where the kids are kind of on their own, and they have the means to solve the problems, and they kind of have to do it on their own because it's just the aloofness of the adults in the room.
That mummy scene reminds me of the scene in Flubber, the
Yes.
recurring scene in Flubber
true.
where the kid looking through his window, and first scene Robin Williams in the car crashing into the tree, the second one being the basketball and the bowling ball go around and the running scared to his parents who don't believe him. On the flip side, on the more narrative side, one thing we've talked about a lot is a lot of these Slimehouse movies are the ones where the kids are teaching the parents the lesson as opposed to the parents teaching the kids the lesson. it's not as direct because there's not necessarily a lesson. It's more, hey, look, we were right. These monsters are running through the city, but it's still that notion of the kids are right. The kids are all right.
Yeah, for sure.
To me, that is really, I think, maybe the strongest theme we see permeating through a lot of these Slimehouse movies, and definitely a benchmark I set personally to determining whether something is a Slimehouse movie besides aesthetics.
Thematically, you're right. The kids have all the agency. The plot feels Slimehouse, but the aesthetic, personally to me, didn't feel super slimy. I think this movie personally has a lot less of the gag type Slimehouse that we know of, and more the thematic broad picture Slimehouse. Because
Definitely.
after one of our last movies, House Arrest, I think, I had a long list of little tiny gags and moments that felt very slimy. This one, I didn't have that. I had 2 or 3, but...
Yeah, I'd say this is certainly the least comedic of the movies we've covered so far on the podcast. Like, there are jokes along the way, and kind of it's a joke in, like, all in all that these kids are fighting, like, the monsters, but there's much less humor. It seems it's more of an adventure movie for sure.
To me, I was thinking this is like a rubber mask enthusiast movie, you know? It's everyone has their rubber masks. And
So this movie, actually had not heard of this movie until we chose to cover it. This movie kind of felt like it was like 82-minute commercial for Party City almost.
Yeah.
Like when you're just like stepping to Party City really quickly, and like
Yeah.
you go around, you might buy like a fake mustache for fun, and you walk out.
To me, it kind of tapped into like a children's subculture that I feel like doesn't really exist as much anymore. Kind of like the horror kid that like does monster makeup and like reads like Fangoria magazine. I feel like that's something that you see represented in a number of 80s movies. In the Friday the 13th movies, they bring in like a character played by Corey Feldman pretty later in the series that is very much like a kid like this, and I feel like that's not really a subculture you see much anymore, but I feel like this is very much tapping into like the horror obsessed kid culture that was more prominent in the 80s, like monster makeup and like loves to read the old monster magazines and watch the old monster movies.
I feel like a comparison today would be superhero movies. I don't think we've necessarily seen a movie that kind of speaks to superhero movies in the same way this speaks to that monster.
Oh, for sure, yeah. This was definitely the peak of like popular horror with Stephen King and like a lot, and like John Carpenter was at his height, slasher movies and all of that. Like, I mean, the kid even wears a Stephen King Rules shirt, as we mentioned earlier, throughout the movie. So I think horror right now is like not a niche genre. It still makes a ton of money, but like horror's not the thing now like it was at the time this movie was made.
I mean, back in the day, it was more about the creatures and the monsters and killer characters, and now it's more so about the atmosphere and the effects.
Yeah, because I mean, when you try to think of like iconic horror characters, you almost always go to 80s or before. There's very few you think of that are 2000s and onward. I feel like horror villain type characters, and a lot of them come from like, I'd say the new Pennywise is maybe an example, and Annabelle or two, but I feel like those kind of draw from 80s tropes. I mean, it's from the 80s, and then the killer doll is very much a Chucky kind of.
I think now the most popular horror-esque thing is Stranger Things, which has a lot in common with this. And Stranger Things is just an 80s throwback is all.
Yeah, for sure. That's like the whole gimmick of the show, and that's why people like it.
I mean, it's a great show, and there's a reason why it's a sensation, but it is very much looking back, whereas these movies were kind of in their place and time more than that. Even though they're looking back at the 30s and the Universal monster movies, but it still feels like an 80s movie.
Yeah, for sure.
And you see this right from the jump too, like in the first opening title crawl, that this is a movie that looks very lovingly back to these Universal horror movies from the 30s. But then you have this title crawl that explains about the history of these monsters, and then the last sentence is they blew it. And so it's just immediate from that jump that this is going to be a subversion of those horror tropes, and that kids are going to be the ones who turn those tropes on their head, I think is what to me makes this very Slimehouse, in that it takes these genre tropes and allows kids to mess with them and rip them apart and take control of a genre.
Yeah, because I mean, like, one of the first scenes in the movie, the kids are walking home from school, and the conversation they're having is about, like, whether the Wolfman has, like, a dick or not. Like, that's the big topic, and that's, like, a running gag throughout the movie for some reason. But yeah, like, that's, like, the early thing is them talking about, like, I think they say the wolf dork is what they keep saying, like, his wolf dork. And so I feel like that kind of established right off the bat, like, that this movie's gonna be lovingly, because the kids are obviously fans of the Wolfman, but poking fun at these characters.
Yeah, and there's the line, which I think is kind of one of the more famous lines in the movie, that after Horace, the fat kid, quote unquote, in the movie, kicks the Wolfman in the nards, the line is literally, "Wolfman's got nards."
Yeah.
Kind of proving their theory correct.
Has a payoff.
There's another line I really love that actually I quoted in my Letterboxd review of this movie. Kind of the cool kid character, as the mummy is kind of falling away from their car in kind of the penultimate chase scene of the movie. He says something like, "Back off, Band-Aid breath."
See you later, Band-Aid breath.
Which is like a total, to me, like, Slimehouse line.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I put that down in my notes, like, bolded, because that felt like such a Slimehouse kind of insult. Band-Aid breath.
One thing that was fun for me was that as they pick off the monsters, they all have one-liners. It's so campy and unashamedly so campy. Again, one of the few true Slimehouse gag type moments / tropes is right in that moment when the mummy's bandage catches the tree and he gives that face expression of like, huh? Right before
Yeah.
when he realizes what's going to happen. And that's such a Slimehouse thing where the character realizes the bad thing is going to happen right before.
Yeah.
Almost like Wile E. Coyote, how Wile E. Coyote only falls after he looks down, sees what's going to happen, then he falls.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, like, we've kind of talked about before how Slimehouse movies generally kind of are translating cartoon to live action, or sometimes not live action, but usually translating, like, the humor and mood of cartoons to live action. I think a lot of that stuff sort of comes from Looney Tunes and those classic cartoons. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of Looney Tunes type gags, I feel like, that sort of go into the Slimehouse
Just
gag,
in real
like,
life.
tropes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that one, the mummy one with his eyes bulging, felt the most slimy.
Yeah, and another one kind of like that. I guess Looney Tunes never goes this far, but we've talked a lot about the emasculation humor, and it's like that's kind of prominent in a lot of these movies, which usually is someone getting kicked in the balls. And in this, there's, of course, as we mentioned, the Wolfman's got nards scene is a classic case of kicked in the balls humor.
So classic, in fact, that it's the name of the documentary about the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I actually didn't realize there was a documentary about, you know, the fandom behind this movie. It does have a pretty significant cult following, which for good reason. You know.
Hey, fat kid. Good job.
My name is Horace.
We haven't really talked about our personal opinions of this movie just yet, but I actually really, really enjoy this movie for what it is. There's definitely such a spirit to this movie, a spirit of adventure and a spirit of zaniness and almost recklessness that is really charismatic and really contagious. And the fact that it is such a brisk, 82 minutes, I think really works in its favor, just because the pace is so fast. It's a movie that is not afraid to admit that it doesn't really have any narrative logic. I mean, it has narrative logic, but
Not a lot.
Yeah.
logic in the sense that a kid is not going to receive Van Helsing's diary on the same day that Dracula ejects himself from an airplane and lands in the same exact small town that this kid is in. And there's a pretty firecracker script that I actually think is really well written, funny, and they just go for it. And I think that trimming of the fat for me in this movie and just getting right to the goods just really works.
It kind of felt like a combination of Goonies and Ghostbusters because the stakes are kind of high to the level of Ghostbusters and the humor's a little more adult than Goonies, a little more targeted towards teens and adults. So I feel like it kind of combines the humor because this felt, even though the characters are kids, and I saw this movie as a kid and I loved it, it definitely feels more adult focused or targeted to adults and older kids than something like Goonies. This works really well as sort of like an action comedy.
Yeah, the Ghostbusters analogy is on point. I think that finale and how it's kind of like this apocalyptic battle with a portal to another dimension, another world. I feel like it really is a product of its time. Like it fits really snugly as like something kids can enjoy, something adults can enjoy with the callbacks to older movies they grew up with. I think it's pretty well rounded. I was impressed with it.
Before we kind of get into some slime scores, do we want to do a quick round of tropes? The kind of just smaller ones? Max, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so I thought the effects, something that really stood out to me on first watch the movie is the effects and makeup are really great. And the effects are actually done by Stan Winston, who did the effects for Terminator, Jurassic Park, Aliens, Predator, which also has Shane Black in it, Batman Returns, a lot of classic sort of very stylized 80s movies, but also worked on a lot of Slimehouse classics. We got Small Soldiers, Shaggy Dog, Mouse Hunt, Inspector Gadget he worked on, and I think he sort of adds a lot of Slimehouse credentials to this with the monster makeup.
One person that has been showing up from the music department, it's a guy named Michael Cimbello. He did music for this movie. He did a lot of the original songs that were in House Arrest and a lot of gigs like that. I think his most famous contribution to a film in terms of original songs is Flashdance, I think Maniac. I think he's someone to look out for as we continue covering these kinds of movies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Maniac's the only one I knew him from. That's like when I saw his name, I was like, oh, the Maniac guy. But in doing my research, he did music for, like you mentioned, House Arrest. He did music for The Big Green, which I feel like is a pretty essential Slimehouse. Blank Check, Mighty Ducks 2, and most iconic to me actually is the music in the scene in Gremlins, the scene in the bar where all the gremlins are sort of just like wreaking havoc in this bar, which it actually references Flashdance at one point. One of the gremlins is doing the whole like Flashdance dance, which I wonder, maybe that's why they got Michael Cimbello for that, and then that's kind of what led to that, because Gremlins I think is the earliest of all these movies, so maybe that's where he started this Slimehouse career.
This one's a little one, but there's definitely some product placement in this, and especially junk food product placement. I think, as we talk about junk food, is a very, very key snack in these Slimehouse movies. And there's two references here. The first one being when the Monster Squad first visits the German neighbor. He feeds them a homemade pie and very prominently cans of Pepsi Cola that they scarf down. And the second one is a big Burger King reference. In the town circle, there's a bright Burger King sign during the final showdown between all the kids and the monsters, which is very, very funny to see.
Yeah, I think it's actually name dropped too. I think at one point, it was Fat Kid says something like, we might as well go do the ritual over at Burger King, because they're like talking about doing the ritual in the church and how it might not work or something, and he like name drops Burger King and it like pans over and shows the Burger King sign, which is like I think the most blatant example of the product placement in this movie. But yeah, the whole Burger King thing is very prominent in this.
And there's a subcategory of junk food that we're going to see more and more in Slimehouse that I see for the first time of the movies we've covered, and that is in the early part of the movie when the fat kid is eating a Snickers bar and then it gets dropped on the ground, and then the older character forces the bully to eat the gross thing, which is something we're going to see a ton of in these movies, where a character, good or bad, depending on the situation, is forced to eat something gross.
Yeah, which, speaking of the bully, moving on to sort of some key Slimehouse players in this movie, the bully actor is Jason Hervey, I think is his name, who also played, most famously, he's the older brother in the Wonder Years, who is sort of a bully type character, and he's the kid who, I guess he's a bully to Pee-wee in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, but the kid that gets Pee-wee's bike and kind of antagonizes him for it in the film, that gets it from Francis, is played by this kid as well. And he's not a bully in it, but he also appears in Back to the Future. He's one of the siblings, I think, of Marty McFly, or I think of Marty McFly's mom when he goes back in time.
So Marty McFly's uncle.
Yeah, Marty McFly's uncle.
Busy actor.
Yeah, lots of bully roles for this guy. Bullies and older brothers, which I feel like are kind of synonymous in a lot of these Slimehouse movies. But
Definitely.
Another big thing. It's a cornerstone of a lot of different, coming of age narratives, movies about kids. Is the treehouse. I think this is the first movie we've covered that does have a treehouse where all the kids kind of congregate and they climb up the ladder and they plan their shenanigans. There's a lot in there with how the kids interact in their own kind of space where the adults aren't allowed. It's another parallel to house arrest for sure. And then I think the slimiest little image I can think of when I think of this movie is when everyone's in there, including the beagle, and they have they put their hands in a circle, and even the dog does it, and his paw is there. So there's just something about that kind of like imagery in the film that I think is very just, classic. Something else like The Sandlot has that in it too.
yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before. This is like a key example of the band of misfits kind of narrative, with all these kids who are all weird in some way, but they're all tied together by their love of monsters, come together to form the Monster Squad together to take care of business and sort of like find themselves in the process.
Yeah, the dog paw on the huddle, I think, is in every single Air Bud movie. And
Oh yeah, for sure.
and yeah, it's Sandlot. And then it's funny because in this it's not a huge gag, but I think with every further iteration it becomes an even bigger and bigger and more amazing thing that the dog can put its hand into the huddle. So you can see it laying some Proto-Slime groundwork.
I remembered this being a little more slimier than it was, but I think this is an extremely strong example of the very beginning of a lot of these tropes. This movie really is the beginning of a lot of those thematic tropes and aesthetic tropes that will really be kind of overblown in a lot of the more later Slimehouse movies.
So with that, do you want to jump in and do slime scores?
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, this is somewhere between a 6 and a 7. It speaks so much to what Slimehouse will become, yet I do think it's a little more raunchy. It does have that PG-13 rating. It is a little bit more of an adventure film. It's not as comedic. There's not a lot of slapstick. But that spirit of Slimehouse is so alive and well in this movie. So for that, I would probably give it a 7.
I am kind of in agreement there. 7 out of 10 seems about right. And I do think it's signaling an evolution from kind of the mid-80s. I think it's really streamlining some of those ideas, character archetypes, and I think it hits the right notes. But it's more interested in paying homage to pre-existing eras and kinds of film that I think it spends more time in that area than the average Slimehouse movie does, and it doesn't have the sheen of the average Slimehouse movie, even though, as I said earlier, a Party City movie. So 7 out of 10.
It's funny, you say all that stuff that kind of counters it. I agree with all of what you said, but I think a 7 out of 10 is too high for me. And I like this movie, but I don't think it's that slimy. I think it's aesthetically not very slimy, and the humor isn't very Slimehouse. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna go lower. I would probably just put it at a 4 because of all the things I agree with you, Jared, on, but I think those to me signal something less Slimehouse and more its own type of thing than Slimehouse primetime.
Okay, sure. I mean, I agree with you about aesthetically it's not as developed as later Slime movies are, and that's kind of why I keep it at a 7. But I think, like, the interactions between the kids and their, the way it kind of film kind of brings you into their world and their interactions. I mean, I think I find it slimy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of have to sort of find a middle ground between your alls. I think I'd go with a 5. The reason I'd go right down the middle is I feel like of like the key sorts of Proto-Slimehouse, I kind of think of, you have your supernatural comedies, sort of Ghostbusters and Gremlins, I would say, are my key examples of that. And then you have your children's adventures, which I'd say Goonies is a key example of that. And this kind of combines those two, which I feel like is kind of a crucial combination to lead to peak Slime, the sort of sci-fi horror comedy mixed with children's adventures. And I think this is a pretty early movie to do that, but I agree completely that aesthetically this movie doesn't really have the Slimehouse look.
Yeah.
And the humor in particular, I feel like is more like Lethal Weapon, Shane Black style humor, but for a younger audience than it is sort of the Slimehouse kind of humor. Like, as far as the Proto-Slime goes, I would say Gremlins is probably closer to Slimehouse, and maybe even Back to the Future. I'd have to rewatch it, but this is definitely a key midpoint where the two Proto-Slime genres sort of combined. And for that, I'd say I'd give it a 5, even though aesthetically and like the gags are not quite Slime. I do like this movie a lot, but I would say it's right down the middle.
You know what? I will concede to both Max and Nelson, and I'm going to drop my score down to a 6. Hearing all those opinions, I think, I was leaning really heavy on the spirit of Slimehouse in my score there, but I think aesthetically, I think it is important to consider this is from 1987, and I think, this is far before the peak of Slimehouse that we'd see in the later 90s, early thousands. So I think you do, taking into consideration that this is the beginning of the evolution does not necessarily mean it is, Slimehouse. It's definitely Proto-Slime. It's definitely, that spirit is so alive and well in this, but it's laying the groundwork in the same way that the Goonies does, in the same way that Weird Science did that we've already talked about. But yeah, so I'm going to drop it down to a 6.
It's like you kind of want to have like a separate rating for some of these earlier movies we talked about, for like how slimy is it, but also like on a scale of 1 to 10, how proto-slimy is it? Like how proto-slimy is Monster Squad?
Because I'd say this is a 10 in Proto-Slime.
This movie may have influenced Slimehouse. I wish this movie had influenced Universal's Dark Universe.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if we got something like this, like for the Dark Universe, that would have been so much fun compared to that mummy, the mummy we got.
I was thinking this could be the team-up movie, because it felt like how Justice League seemed when I was a kid, like the cartoon of Justice League, of like, oh, all the heroes you like packed into one room, and this is kind of what that is. And so in a way, it's sort of like wish fulfillment for what Dark Universe could have been.
And interestingly, this was all done without licensing, which I think is why he's referred to as Gillman throughout the movie. So I can only imagine what they would have done with licensed Universal characters.
I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to bring up that trivia that I saw, that none of these characters were licensed from Universal, so it's all very suggestive and avoiding specific names of people.
Which, interestingly, the end credits rap, which I also think I forgot to mention, that's a very Slimehouse sort of thing. There's an end credits rap that summarizes the events of the movie, which I think is by Michael Cimbello, who's not a rapper, but I guess decided to take on this task anyways. And yeah, but that says Creature from the Black Lagoon, so I wonder if maybe they got licensing for the song but not the movie, because I think that's the only time Creature from the Black Lagoon is said in the movie instead of Gillman.
I don't think you need to get licensing rights to sing something in a song.
Just to depict him would be.
I think it's the marriage of name and likeness. And that wraps up this week of Slimehouse, the first of 5 episodes tackling some of the spookiest slime movies in celebration of Halloween coming up. Again, I'm Jasper.
I'm Jared.
I'm Max.
And I'm Nelson.
And we'll see you next week for some more pumpkin spice slime.